Welcome to Wealth and Means. Advice dressed up like hard work.
Today's episode is stacked. We begin with what you didn't see in the news, where the quiet signals are doing the loudest work. Orbital sovereignty, shipping choke points, wartime gold, world models, wireless risk, hidden communications, edge efficiency, creator franchises, cold chain logistics, and autonomy that goes to work before it goes to marketing. Then we move into Wake Up Ready, where the week ahead runs straight through the Federal Reserve, labor softness, treasury supply, energy risk, and the capital intensity of the AI build-out. After that comes Knowledge Bomb, with a deeper look at prediction itself, not just who sees change first, but whether the future belongs to disciplined human judgment, synthetic swarms, or some uneasy alliance between the two. Then Humor Me turns to tax season, where compliance, confusion, and self-justifying deduction logic reveal more about behavior than most market surveys ever will. From there, the greater debate asks what ownership really means in a digital economy. And Let's Invent Again closes on Frank Whittle, where constraint, experimentation, and system-level rethinking turn dismissed theory into evidence. Each week, we explore ideas that help you pause, reflect, and think more deeply about the opportunities all around you.
It's the perfect mix. A little information, a few stats, some real-world insights, and just enough deep talk to make you feel smarter before your second cup of coffee. A quick thank you to our sponsor, agentweekly.ai, chronicling the absurd, the ambitious, and the algorithmically challenged corners of the AI agent economy. Most weeks, the loudest stories are the easiest ones to find. The more interesting move is usually somewhere off to the side, where a technical detail, a logistics bottleneck, or a niche product shift starts telling you what the next headline is going to be before it gets the headline treatment. It's what you didn't see in the news. The first one is happening above the atmosphere. According to reporting picked up by New Scientist and others, militaries are looking a lot harder at building their own low Earth orbit communications constellations instead of depending on a commercial network and hoping the business model lines up with national strategy. The conversation here is not really about rockets. It is about sovereignty. If battlefield connectivity, remote operations, and encrypted communications all ride on privately controlled orbital infrastructure, then telecom resilience starts to look a lot like defense procurement. And the reason it popped this week is simple. The advantages of Starlink-style connectivity have become obvious enough that every serious military planner now has to ask the uncomfortable question of who owns the pipe.
Right, because once the battlefield runs on subscription software in space, the terms of service start sounding less like a legal document and more like a strategic vulnerability.
And that same pattern shows up one layer down in Oman. The more useful Middle East story this week was not just the main conflict actors, but the second circle geography around them. Maritime risk updates and regional coverage put fresh attention on drone threats and security advisories around Oman, including port infrastructure and the wider approaches to the Strait of Hormuz. The key fact is that Oman matters because it sits near the plumbing, not the podium. When activity shifts there, the implication is not simply more regional tension. It is higher shipping risk, higher insurance costs, and more pressure on every energy buyer pretending that adjacent territory is somehow peripheral. It surfaced this week because the map of concern widened from direct combat to the transit corridors that keep trade moving. Which leads to the anchor story, because the number doing the rounds is almost absurd. Morgan Stanley called it the 20 million barrels of oil conundrum. That is roughly the scale of daily oil flow tied to the Strait of Hormuz, a figure so large it stops sounding like a market variable and starts sounding like a systems problem. The important detail is that oil prices are set in the flexible seaborne market, and losing a chunk that large is not the same as trimming a little supply around the edges. It is a physical throughput shock. Why that matters is that geopolitics gets translated into freight routes, rerouting limits, reserve drawdowns, and recession math very quickly once the choke point itself is constrained. It drew fresh attention this week because the discussion moved from, could this escalate, to what exactly can the system absorb?
That is the difference between a scary headline and a spreadsheet that suddenly starts yelling at you.
Now take that same blend of hard assets and conflict networks and move southwest to Sudan. One of the stranger undercovered threads this week was the growing focus on gold moving through wartime channels while drones become a more central part of the conflict economy. Recent reporting and regional coverage have highlighted how Sudan's gold trade, much of it informal or smuggled, has become entangled with foreign interests, financing pressures, and the broader drone heavy character of the war. The conversation is not just that gold is valuable, it is that gold remains one of the easiest ways to store, move, and obscure wartime value when formal systems break down. That matters because it links commodity markets, sanctions evasion, and battlefield capability in one loop. It popped now because drone attacks have intensified, just as scrutiny of Sudan's wartime gold flows has picked up again. From there, the next story is a different kind of arms race. The cleanest post-LLM signal this week was the rise of world models as the next serious AI layer. The hook is that the industry is trying to build machines that do not just predict words, but simulate environments, objects, movement, and cause and effect. Reuters and others have been documenting just how large the infrastructure bill has become, with major tech companies expected to spend around $650 billion this year on data centers, chips, and power. The key fact is that world model style systems are compute hungry because video, physics, and real world prediction are much heavier than text. Why that matters is that the next AI boom may be less about chat and more about robotics, industrial automation, planning, and simulation. It hit this week because infrastructure spending has gotten so large that investors are now asking what comes after the chatbot phase.
So the short version is the next $1 trillion may be spent teaching AI not to talk more, but to understand where the chair is before it walks into it.
And that craving for realism has a shadow side. Bastille's new wireless security report got less attention than it probably deserved, but the numbers are blunt. 937 wireless-related CVEs were disclosed in 2025, about 2.5 per day, with growth far outpacing the wider vulnerability landscape. The reason this matters is that the cyber story keeps getting framed as big breaches and dramatic ransomware events, when a lot of real exposure is just the silent expansion of radios, sensors, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, cellular modules, and machine-to-machine links. In other words, more things are talking, and more of them are talking insecurely. It came into view this week because the report landed with enough scale to make wireless risk look less like a niche concern and more like a baseline infrastructure problem. That concern with hidden signals takes us nicely into one of the more fascinating science stories of the week. Researchers at the University of New South Wales, covered by the university and picked up by Live Science, demonstrated what they call negative light technology, a way of hiding information inside natural heat radiation using negative luminescence. In plain English, instead of sending a bright, obvious signal, the system lets data blend into thermal background noise. The key fact here is that the team reported transmission around 100 kilobits per second in the early setup, with the concept pointing much further. Why it matters is that security is not just about encrypting the message anymore. It is increasingly about concealing that a message exists at all. It drew attention this week because it sounds like science fiction, but it is now science with a lab result attached.
It is also one of those stories where hard to intercept sounds elegant until you remember every intelligence agency on Earth just sat up a little straighter.
That same efficiency over brute force theme is now showing up inside AI model design. A quieter but important shift is growing interest in joint embedding predictive architectures, or JEPA-style systems, for low-latency voice and audio tasks. The hook is that not every problem wants a giant autoregressive language model dragging a piano up the stairs. In audio research, including work like Audio JEPA, the idea is to predict higher-level representations instead of reconstructing or generating every raw token in sequence. That matters because voice products live and die on latency. Users do not care how philosophically impressive your model is if it pauses too long before answering. It gained traction this week because more builders are looking for architectures that feel fast and native in real time settings instead of merely large. And once you start caring about latency, you inevitably end up lower in the stack. Daniel Lemire's recent post on prefix sums with ARM Neon might sound like a niche topic for people who alphabetize their cache lines, but it points to something broader. The key fact is that low-level vectorized optimization can push common operations to tens of gigabytes per second on modern ARM hardware. That matters because the future of edge AI is not just bigger models. It is efficient local execution on constrained chips, batteries, and thermal budgets. According to ARM's own embedded world messaging this month, always-on AI inside embedded power limits is becoming a real design goal. This one surfaced now because power and cost constraints are forcing attention back down from app demos to the underlying math.
Which is not flashy, but every boom eventually rediscovers that the laws of physics are still in management.
The consumer version of that shift is happening in commerce, not compute. One of the more useful global signals this week was the rise of hyperlocal shoppable video, especially in Southeast Asia and parts of Latin America. Recent regional commerce coverage shows video commerce becoming a major share of e-commerce behavior in Southeast Asia, with merchants using local content, local language, and local trust to move product. The interesting fact is that this is not celebrity shopping. It is boutique owners, neighborhood sellers, and merchant creators closing the loop from video to checkout. Why that matters is that social commerce may end up scaling through distributed local trust rather than through a handful of giant influencers. It popped this week because the data and campaign evidence increasingly show video commerce behaving like infrastructure, not a gimmick. That same pattern shows up in media. Small creators are increasingly trying to build digital franchises instead of just landing one viral post and praying for rent money next month. You see it in serialized formats, recurring characters, repeatable worlds, and lore that can travel across shorts, podcasts, streams, and merch. Deloitte and other media forecasts have been pointing to the growing importance of episodic short-form formats, and beauty and creator commerce coverage this month keeps returning to the idea that serialized content now behaves more like programming than posting. Why that matters is simple. A franchise has retention, memory, and monetization in a way a one-off hit does not. It drew more attention this week because creator strategy talk is shifting from growth hacks to intellectual property.
Which is a much healthier business model than waking up every morning and asking the algorithm if it still likes you.
On the personal finance side, the standout media signal was Money Rehab with Nicole Lapin. Podscribe's February rankings, highlighted by Pod News, called it the breakout show after about a 70% surge in audio reach, put it into the top 10. The fact worth noticing is not just that it grew. It is that the show's format stays short, direct, and service-oriented in a category that often swings between jargon and guilt. That matters because personal economics continues to reward brands that translate money into usable decisions without turning every episode into either a sermon or a spreadsheet. It showed up this week because the new rankings made the breakout visible enough to count as a signal, not just a hunch. Then there is Americold Realty, ticker COLD, which is interesting precisely because it sounds boring. The company operates temperature-controlled warehouses across multiple countries, and the stock has been trading much closer to its lows than its highs. The reason it belongs in this set is not because cold storage suddenly became sexy. It is because cold storage sits inside food distribution, pharmaceuticals, inventory timing, electricity usage, and real-world logistics resilience. In other words, this is physical infrastructure hiding in plain sight. The attention reason this week was the combination of renewed market chatter around the name and the broader realization that logistics assets tied to perishables are not side notes in the economy. They are part of the operating system. And finally, a good counterweight to all the software talk, Arbe Robotics. The company announced new high-definition imaging radar for off-highway applications in agriculture, mining, and construction. And that last part is the point. Most autonomy discussion still defaults to passenger cars because the consumer story is easier to picture. But according to Arby's release, the focus here is harsh environments, difficult visibility, and industrial use cases where perception reliability matters more than futuristic branding. Why it matters is that some of the most commercially real autonomy may emerge far from suburban roads, in places where labor shortages, safety, and machine uptime already carry a hard dollar value. It surfaced this week because the launch gave investors and operators a concrete reminder that autonomy has a heavy equipment lane too.
Which is usually where a lot of technologies grow up. First they go to work, then they go to marketing.
Remember, the loud story is still hype? The quieter one is that systems are getting more physical, more constrained, and more strategic. Now, let's wake up ready and orient ourselves for the week ahead in markets and the real economy. Right now, the system is sitting in a phase you could describe as moderating liquidity expansion inside a bifurcated economy. Parts of the system are cooling, particularly labor and some real economy indicators. But at the same time, fiscal spending is still pouring capital into the system, and technology investment is accelerating at an extraordinary pace. And sitting right at the center of all of it this week is the Federal Reserve. The Fed meets midweek, and this is the first time policymakers have to formally update their economic projections while incorporating several new developments all at once: a surprise drop in payrolls, inflation that has stopped falling, and geopolitical pressure on energy markets.
So the Fed is walking into this meeting with a slightly messier picture than they probably expected a few months ago.
Exactly. February non-farm payrolls came in negative 92,000. Unemployment ticked up to about 4.4%. At the same time, core PCE inflation is still running around 3.1% year over year. So the labor market is cooling, but inflation hasn't finished the job. Meanwhile, on the other side of the economy, the technology investment cycle is doing the exact opposite. Hyperscalers have already signaled roughly $650 billion in combined capital spending for 2026. Amazon alone is guiding around $200 billion. Alphabet around 180, Meta north of 100 billion, Microsoft running at a pace approaching 145 billion. Almost all of that is AI infrastructure. And then layered on top of everything else is fiscal policy. The federal deficit is still projected around $1.85 trillion this fiscal year, roughly 5.8% of GDP. So right now, the system is being shaped by three structural forces moving at the same time: a gradually softening labor market, enormous technology investment, and persistent fiscal supply. Those forces define the phase we're in. Now, let's talk about the slow drifts already underway, the things that will likely keep moving unless something interrupts them. The first is the AI capital cycle. Hyperscalers continue to expand data center and GPU infrastructure because demand for compute keeps outrunning forecasts. That investment wave has taken on a momentum of its own. It no longer depends on whether GDP growth is 2% or 3%. The second drift is fiscal supply. Deficits are structurally large, and that means steady Treasury issuance. Interest costs alone are rising fast enough that even stable spending would still push borrowing higher over time. The third drift is labor softening. Payroll growth has slowed for months, revisions have moved downward, and hiring momentum in the private sector is clearly cooling. It's not a contraction yet, but the direction is unmistakable. The fourth drift is inflation persistence. Core inflation readings have stopped falling the way they were a year ago, and now energy markets are layering in an additional geopolitical risk premium tied to Middle East tensions and potential disruption through the Strait of Hormuz. Fifth, credit markets remain surprisingly calm. Investment-grade spreads are still near multi-decade lows around 78 basis points. High yield is sitting roughly between 2.7 and 3.2%. Credit is available and issuance continues. And finally, energy supply remains constrained. OPEC Plus has extended production cuts, and geopolitical risk means oil markets are pricing in at least some probability of disruption. Put all of that together, and the trajectory becomes clearer. The economy is cooling gradually. Inflation is not falling as quickly as hoped. Fiscal policy continues to inject supply into capital markets. And technology investment is running at a speed that makes the rest of the economy look almost slow by comparison.
Which raises the obvious question, when do those two worlds collide? Because right now it almost sounds like we're describing two different economies.
That's exactly the tension. And this week's calendar is basically a series of tests for that story. Tuesday starts with the ADP Private Employment Report. That will give us an early read on whether February's negative payroll number was just noise or whether hiring really is slowing in a more persistent way. Tuesday also brings Treasury bill auctions, 4-week, 8-week, and 17-week maturities. Those auctions are one of the quiet, real-time gauges of how comfortably markets are absorbing the steady flow of government borrowing. Wednesday is the main event. The Federal Reserve releases its policy statement, the updated summary of economic projections, the famous dot plot, and then Chair Powell steps up for the press conference. This is the first time the Fed formally incorporates the latest labor data, persistent inflation readings, and geopolitical energy risks into its forward guidance. Markets will watch every word. If the Fed still signals at least one potential rate cut later in the year, investors will interpret that as confirmation that liquidity conditions can gradually loosen. If the dot plot shifts toward fewer cuts or a longer hold, that suggests the central bank is becoming more cautious about inflation and energy shocks. Thursday brings weekly jobless claims. It's a small number, but an important signal. Claims are one of the fastest ways to see whether labor momentum is deteriorating. Friday rounds things out with new home sales. Housing is one of the most interest rate sensitive parts of the economy, so it's a good early test of whether slower hiring and higher energy costs are starting to filter into consumer demand.
So Wednesday sets the narrative, but the rest of the week either reinforces it or starts poking holes in it.
Exactly right. Now let's talk about fragility, where the system could react more sharply than people expect. One pressure point is Treasury demand. As deficits remain large, the market has to continuously absorb new issuance. If auctions start showing weak demand or higher clearing yields, that would push interest rates upward and tighten financial conditions quickly. The second fragility point is labor momentum. If employment data continues to deteriorate, markets will begin to shift from a slow cooling narrative to something closer to an early downturn. And the third pressure point is energy. Any escalation affecting shipping through the Strait of Hormuz could push crude oil prices sharply higher. If oil moves into the $85 to $90 range and stays there, inflation expectations would rise again, and the Fed's room to ease policy would shrink. That brings us to the concrete signals to watch. If Treasury auctions start clearing poorly, low bid-to-cover ratios, or weak foreign participation, that would suggest government borrowing is beginning to strain market liquidity. If employment indicators drop sharply again, or jobless claims jump meaningfully week to week, the labor slowdown could turn into something more serious. If oil prices spike and hold above the high 80s, inflation could begin reaccelerating. If the Fed's projections show fewer expected rate cuts than markets anticipate, financial conditions could tighten quickly. And if credit spreads widen suddenly after sitting near historic lows, that would signal that investors are beginning to price in more economic risk.
Those are the moments where the story can flip fast.
Exactly. And finally, a quick look at the shadow calendar, the things that influence markets without always making headlines. Treasury issuance continues week after week. It's not dramatic, but it is relentless, and every auction quietly tests the market's ability to absorb that supply. Developments in the Middle East can move energy markets within hours, even before formal policy responses appear. And any new commentary from the big hyperscalers about AI infrastructure spending will reinforce the idea that the technology investment cycle is still accelerating, regardless of the Fed. Put simply, the background rhythm right now is fiscal supply, geopolitical energy risk, and a massive technology capex wave. So that's your map for the week ahead. Understand the phase, watch the key tests, pay attention to the fragility points, and keep an eye on the signals that would tell us the trajectory is changing. We'll keep tracking it with you all week. And that's how you wake up ready.
Thanks, Wealth. Let's see what the data says. Here's a knowledge bomb that might change the way you think about prediction. For decades, the intelligence community believed the key to forecasting the future was better information. More satellites, more intercepts, more analysts reading more reports. But in 2011, a strange little experiment quietly challenged that assumption. The Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Activity, IARPA, ran a forecasting tournament. Thousands of ordinary people were asked questions about geopolitics. Would North Korea conduct a nuclear test? Would the Eurozone lose a member state? Participants assigned probabilities, and their predictions were scored mathematically using something called a Breyer score. What emerged surprised everyone. A tiny fraction of participants, about 2%, consistently outperformed intelligence analysts with access to classified information. Not occasionally, consistently, by about 30%. These people became known as super forecasters. And here's the key insight. They didn't have better data. They had better thinking. Super forecasters break problems into pieces. They update probabilities constantly. They think in shades of likelihood instead of yes or no certainty. Tetlock called them foxes, thinkers who know many small things, rather than hedgehogs, the experts who know one big thing and apply it everywhere. But there was a catch. You can't manufacture super forecasters on demand. Identifying them takes years of track records. Training them takes time. And even the best forecasting teams operate on the tempo of human deliberation, days, sometimes weeks. And that limitation matters because the modern world moves faster than that. Which brings us to a very different experiment unfolding right now. Instead of finding exceptional human forecasters, some researchers are building synthetic societies. There's a new open source project called Mirofish that spins up hundreds or thousands of AI agents, each with a different personality, background, and memory. These agents interact with each other inside a simulated social environment. They argue, persuade, shift opinions, respond to news events, essentially modeling how real populations behave. The system feeds those agents real-world data through something called a knowledge graph. So the simulation is grounded in reality rather than imagination. And then a meta-agent, called a report agent, analyzes the patterns that emerge from thousands of interactions. In other words, instead of asking a few brilliant people what they think will happen, the system creates an entire synthetic population and watches what unfolds. And here's where things get interesting. At a structural level, the super forecaster model and the AI swarm model are actually solving the same problem. Both rely on aggregation. One aggregates human minds, the other aggregates artificial ones. Both rely on diversity. Super forecaster teams work best when people think differently. Swarm systems encode that diversity directly into the agents. And both rely on weighted synthesis, turning a noisy collection of opinions into a single probabilistic signal. But the differences are just as important. Super forecasters are transparent. They can explain their reasoning step by step. Swarm systems are fast. A human forecasting tournament might take weeks. A swarm simulation can run in minutes. And speed changes the game. Imagine a financial crisis starting to ripple through markets, or a viral narrative spreading across social media. Instead of analysts slowly debating what might happen, a swarm system could simulate thousands of potential reactions across a synthetic population and show which outcomes cascade. Not just what might happen, but how second and third order effects propagate. In the world of strategic warning, that matters enormously. There's a framework used in intelligence and risk analysis called the 4C Forecast Alert Warn cycle. It's basically the pipeline that turns raw signals into actionable warnings for decision makers. Historically, the hardest step in that cycle has been forecast, turning messy information into structured probabilities. Human forecasters are excellent at calibrated judgments on clear questions, but swarm systems are powerful at exploring complex social dynamics, the messy ripple effects of policy changes, market shocks, or viral narratives, which suggests something important about the future of forecasting. It's probably not the sage versus the swarm. It's the sage and the swarm. Human super forecasters for disciplined probability estimates, AI agent collectives for rapid scenario exploration. One brings transparency and judgment, the other brings scale and speed. And together they may reshape how organizations detect risks before they become crises. But here's the final twist, and the part that rarely gets discussed. Prediction has never been the hardest problem in strategic warning. The hardest problem is what happens after the forecast. History is full of accurate warnings that leaders ignored. Pearl Harbor, the financial crisis, pandemics. The signal was there, the probabilities were known. The failure was human. So even if AI swarms make forecasting dramatically better, the last mile remains the same as it's always been. Information doesn't change the world. Decisions do. And that means the future of foresight won't belong to the smartest algorithm or even the best forecaster. It will belong to the organizations that learn how to listen before it's too late. And that's the knowledge bomb.
Every year around tax season, millions of otherwise rational adults sit down with a stack of forms and suddenly become amateur forensic accountants. Humor me. It's the one time of year where perfectly normal people find themselves whispering things like, technically, that printer ink was used for business. Which is fascinating because taxes are probably the only system in modern life where the government says, please calculate exactly how much you owe us. And if you get it wrong, you're the criminal. Now, if you step back and look at the structure of the whole thing, filing taxes is basically the world's largest open book exam, where the answer key exists, but you're not allowed to see it. Think about the incentives here. The government already knows roughly what you made. Your employer reported it. Your bank reported it. Your brokerage reported it. Somewhere in a server farm, there's a spreadsheet that basically says, yep, looks like John made about this much. But instead of sending you the bill, they mail you a puzzle. Here are 18 documents. Now reconstruct your financial life like a historical archaeologist. And the complexity has reached the point where people have developed entire personality archetypes around tax filing. You've got the spreadsheet general. This person starts preparing their taxes in mid-January. They have folders, color coding, backup folders for the folders. They talk about depreciation schedules the way other people talk about fantasy football. Then there's the deadline sprinter. This person opens the software on April 14th at 11:07 p.m. and says the most dangerous sentence in personal finance. How hard could this be? And of course, there's the most interesting category, the optimistic deduction theorist. These are the people who look at every purchase in their life and ask the philosophical question, what is a business expense really? Obviously. Coffee shop meetings, networking. Standing desk, ergonomics. The espresso machine, well, productivity infrastructure. If this trend continues, I'm convinced that within 10 years, someone will attempt to deduct their dog. Look, technically he guards the home office. And my favorite moment in the whole process is the psychological journey inside tax software. It always starts the same way. Welcome. This will only take about 30 minutes. 30 minutes later, you're 6 screens deep into a questionnaire asking whether you conducted commercial activity involving agricultural land in 3 or more jurisdictions. And you're thinking, I just had a W-2. But my favorite part of tax season is the little progress bar at the top of the screen. Because it says something like, you're 82% done, but emotionally you're about 12%. The progress bar is the most optimistic economic forecast in America. But the real comedy is this. Despite all the frustration, filing taxes is actually one of the clearest signals of economic activity we have. Every deduction tells a story. A new business started, a house bought, an investment made, Someone trying, maybe a little too creatively, to turn expenses into strategy. Which means tax season might be the only time of year where millions of people sit down, look directly at their financial life, and do a full annual audit of their decisions. So, yes, the forms are confusing. The software asks weird questions. And at some point, we all briefly consider whether a standing desk counts as structural infrastructure. But in markets, clarity is expensive. And once a year, the tax code gives everyone the same investment lesson. Before you optimize the deductions, it helps to understand the income.
Some debates are polite disagreements, others clear dinner tables. It's time for the greater debate. Tonight's question falls into the second category because it reaches into something most people assume they already understand: ownership. It sounds straightforward. You buy something, you own it. A share of a company, a piece of land. Maybe a factory if things go well. But the internet has a habit of taking simple words and stretching them until the definition starts to wobble. The question before us tonight is deceptively compact. Is the future of ownership still the humble share of stock, or is it something stranger, tokens embedded in networks that don't even have a company attached? At one lectern stands Chris Dixon, venture capitalist, technologist, and one of the most articulate advocates for what he calls the next phase of the internet. His thesis is that the architecture of the web is shifting from platforms to protocols. In the early days of the internet, anyone could publish information, but the economic power consolidated quickly into platforms, companies that control distribution, identity, and data. Dixon believes blockchains introduce something new: ownership native to the network itself. Tokens, in his view, allow users, developers, and early participants to hold pieces of the infrastructure they helped build. Across the stage stands Charlie Munger, investor, Berkshire Hathaway vice chairman for decades, and perhaps the most feared skeptic in modern finance. Munger's worldview is built on a brutally simple rule: if an asset does not produce cash, you should be very careful calling it an investment. Businesses create value because they produce goods, services, and earnings. Ownership in his framework is a legal claim on those earnings. Anything untethered from that process begins to look suspiciously like speculation. The room settles. Dixon begins. He starts with history. The internet, he says, democratized distribution but not ownership. Millions of people could write code, publish content, build communities, but the platforms they relied on captured most of the economic value. The creators produced the activity. The platforms owned the infrastructure. That imbalance, Dixon argues, was not inevitable. It was simply the architecture we had available. Blockchains change that architecture. A network can now distribute ownership directly through tokens. These tokens do several jobs at once. They can grant governance rights. They can coordinate incentives. They can reward early adopters. And most importantly, they allow the participants in a network to become partial owners of the system itself. Dixon leans into a phrase he's used for years: protocols instead of platforms. The internet already runs on open protocols, things like email and the web itself. But those protocols never had economic layers attached to them. Tokens introduce programmable ownership into infrastructure that anyone can use. The result, he argues, is a new model for building digital systems. The old internet worked like this: companies built platforms, users generated value, and shareholders captured the upside. The new model, Dixon suggests, lets users, developers, and investors share in the growth of the network together. Ownership spreads outward rather than concentrating upward. In that world, tokens are not casino chips. They are digital property rights for internet infrastructure. There's a ripple of interest in the room. Then Munger steps forward. His opening is almost disarmingly calm. For most of modern economic history, he says, ownership has meant something very specific. You own a piece of something productive. A farm produces crops. A factory produces goods. A business produces earnings. Those earnings eventually flow back to the owners. That link between productivity and cash flow is what anchors value. Remove that anchor, Munger warns, and strange things happen. Human beings are very good at convincing themselves that an asset is valuable simply because someone else might pay more for it later. History contains entire museums of such episodes. Tulips, South Sea shares, radio stocks in the 1920s, dot-com companies with no revenue. Most tokens, he continues, do not represent ownership in a business. They are not claims on profits. They do not entitle holders to dividends or earnings. Their value depends largely on the price someone else will pay tomorrow. That, to Munger, begins to resemble speculation markets more than investment markets. The audience shifts, the air tightens. Dixon responds without defensiveness. The criticism, he says, assumes that economic systems must always be organized as companies. But networks can also coordinate economic activity. Ethereum, for example, isn't a firm with headquarters and quarterly earnings calls. It's an open infrastructure layer that thousands of developers build on. Billions of dollars of applications run on top of it. Tokens provide the mechanism that keeps that network functioning, rewarding participants who secure the system, contribute resources, and expand the ecosystem. In that sense, Dixon argues, tokens are not replacing equity. They are enabling ownership in systems that never had an ownership structure before. If the internet itself had been tokenized from the beginning, the people who built its early infrastructure might have shared in its enormous growth rather than watching centralized platforms capture most of the value. Munger listens. Then he lands the first moment that rattles the room. He says usefulness and ownership are not the same thing. Airline miles are useful, casino chips are useful, but no one pretends they represent productive capital. Just because a token has utility inside a network does not automatically make it an investment asset. A payment mechanism is not the same thing as an ownership stake in something generating earnings. And then comes the sharper edge. Many token systems, he says, rely heavily on the belief that the price will rise because more participants will arrive later. That dynamic may work for a while, it always has, but history suggests those structures eventually collide with reality when the supply of new buyers slows down. A quiet gasp moves through the audience. Dixon doesn't retreat. Instead, he concedes something important. Yes, speculative excess has been rampant in crypto markets. Many token projects are poorly designed, many will fail, but technological transitions often arrive wrapped in speculation. Early railroad stocks were chaotic. Early internet companies collapsed by the hundreds. That turbulence, he argues, does not invalidate the underlying architecture. Then Dixon presses his own pressure point. Platforms today extract enormous economic value from users and developers who help build their ecosystems. Tokenized networks attempt to distribute that value more broadly. If the participants in a system are also its owners, the incentives align differently. Builders contribute because they benefit directly from the network's growth. Munger pauses before responding, and when he does, there's a moment of intellectual honesty that shifts the tone of the room. He acknowledges that centralized platforms have indeed accumulated extraordinary power. The internet's economic structure may not be perfectly fair, and new technological systems can absolutely reshape how value flows through the economy. But fairness, he says, does not determine whether an asset is sound. Cash flow does, productivity does. Ownership that is not ultimately tied to real economic output remains fragile. Markets eventually ask a simple question: where does the money come from? Near the end, Dixon offers his own concession. Tokens will not replace traditional equity. Businesses will still exist. Factories will still produce things. Stocks will still represent ownership in companies generating earnings. But digital infrastructure is beginning to look less like companies and more like networks. And networks may require their own form of ownership, one that distributes economic participation across the people who build and maintain them. The debate slows, the tension lingers. One side believes ownership must remain anchored to productive enterprises. The other believes ownership can extend to decentralized systems coordinating economic activity in entirely new ways. The audience sits with the thought that perhaps both ideas are true, and that the future may involve an uneasy coexistence between the world of companies and the world of networks. Because the deeper question isn't whether tokens replace stocks, It's whether some parts of the economy are quietly evolving from firms into protocols, and whether ownership must evolve with them. And that is the greater debate.
Let's invent again. Frank Whittle did not set out to become a hero of aviation. He started as a young Royal Air Force officer with a problem that bothered him more than it seemed to bother anyone else. In the late 1920s, airplanes were hitting a wall. Propeller aircraft were improving every year. Better materials, better aerodynamics, better engines, but the underlying physics was starting to show limits. If you wanted to go faster, you spun a propeller harder. But propellers lose efficiency as aircraft approach the speed of sound. The faster you tried to go, the less cooperative the air became. Whittle noticed something subtle but important while training as a pilot and later studying engineering at the Royal Air Force College. Aircraft were flying higher and higher, but their engines were actually becoming less effective in thin air. Combustion engines designed for ground vehicles were being pushed into an environment they were never meant for. Pilots and engineers were solving the symptoms: superchargers, more powerful pistons, but not the core constraint. So Whittle asked a slightly different question. Instead of using an engine to spin a propeller that pulls an aircraft forward, what if the engine simply accelerated air directly backward? In hindsight, the concept feels almost obvious. If you push mass backward fast enough, Newton takes care of the rest and pushes you forward. Rockets already work that way, but rockets burn fuel quickly and carry their own oxygen. Whittle's insight was subtler. The atmosphere itself could provide the oxygen and most of the working mass. His proposed machine was elegant in theory. Pull air into the front of the engine, compress it, mix it with fuel, ignite the mixture, and then expel the resulting high-velocity exhaust through a nozzle. The faster that stream exited the back, the faster the aircraft would move forward. Today we call it a turbojet. In 1929, it sounded to many people like fantasy. Whittle filed his patent in 1930, while still in his early 20s. The design described the essential architecture we now recognize: a compressor to squeeze incoming air, a combustion chamber where fuel burns continuously, a turbine that extracts energy from the exhaust to power the compressor, and a nozzle that accelerates the remaining gases into thrust. It was a beautifully closed loop. Air came in, energy was added, and the exhaust powered the system that kept it all running. On paper, it worked. In practice, almost no one believed it would. The British Air Ministry reviewed his proposal and essentially shrugged. The engineering challenge looked enormous. Compressors capable of handling those airflow rates barely existed. Turbines that could survive the temperatures inside the engine were pushing the limits of metallurgy. And the military bureaucracy of the 1930s had other priorities. So the idea sat. This is where the story gets interesting, because Whittle didn't abandon it. He started testing it. Not with a finished engine, not with a government lab, with a small private company and a lot of improvisation. In 1936, after years of rejection, a group of investors helped Whittle form a company called Powerjets. It was less a polished aerospace firm than a workshop dedicated to proving that his idea wasn't crazy. The first engines were crude, temperamental machines. Compressors vibrated violently, combustion chambers overheated, bearings failed. Fuel flow had to be tuned with extreme precision or the flame would either extinguish or run away. One of the hardest problems was stability. Unlike a piston engine, which burns fuel in controlled bursts, Whittle's design relied on continuous combustion. If airflow fluctuated or pressure changed in the wrong way, the flame could surge through the compressor like a backfire inside a metal tornado. Testing those early engines was closer to controlled chaos than laboratory science. But Whittle had a habit that good engineers share. He treated every failure as data. Instead of discarding prototypes, he instrumented them. Thermocouples measured temperature. Pressure gauges tracked airflow behavior. Small design changes were tested one variable at a time. If a compressor blade cracked, he studied the stress patterns. If combustion oscillated, he redesigned the chamber geometry. The engine evolved through iteration rather than a single breakthrough. and slowly the pieces began to cooperate. By 1941, after more than a decade of skepticism and incremental engineering, the Whittle W1 turbojet was ready for something audacious: flight. The aircraft chosen for the test was the Gloster E-2839, a small experimental plane designed essentially as a flying engine testbed. On May 15th of that year, it lifted off the runway powered by Whittle's engine. The flight lasted just 17 minutes. But aviation had crossed a threshold. For the first time, an aircraft propelled not by propellers, but by a jet engine had taken to the air. And the implications were immediate. Jets could fly faster because they did not rely on propellers interacting with the air in the same way. They performed better at high altitude because the engine actually thrived on compressing thin air, and their power scaled with airflow and temperature rather than piston size. Within a few years, jet aircraft were redefining military aviation. Within a few decades, they were redefining global transportation. The interesting part of the story isn't just the invention itself, it's the pattern behind it. Whittle didn't win by having a mysterious flash of genius. He won by reframing a constraint. Everyone else in aviation was asking how to make propeller aircraft faster. Whittle asked whether the propeller was the problem. That shift from improving a component to replacing the system shows up over and over again in technological history. It's what happened when semiconductors replaced vacuum tubes, when packet switching replaced circuit switching in networks, when software ate functions that once required specialized hardware. The people who drive these changes are rarely the ones polishing the existing design. They're the ones willing to imagine a machine that works differently from the ground up. But there's another lesson hiding in Whittle's story that matters just as much. Ideas alone don't move industries. Testing does. For more than 10 years, Whittle's concept existed mostly as a theory that experts dismissed. It only became inevitable after engines were built, broken, measured, and rebuilt again. The messy, iterative work of experimentation transformed a speculative design into an operating machine. That is the real moment when innovation becomes real. When someone stops arguing about whether something could work and starts measuring why it doesn't, yet. Because once the testing begins, the future starts leaving evidence. And if you're paying attention to the evidence, even the most radical ideas begin to look less like fantasy and more like the next obvious step. That's it for another episode of Wealth and Means, advice dressed up like hard work.
We hope you enjoyed the arc. From taxes to tokens, signals before slogans, and proof before permission. The pattern was simple. See clearly, think concretely, test relentlessly. Because first principles are rarely flashy, but they are usually where the future first becomes visible.
Subscribe, rate, and share this episode. It helps more than you think.
We do this for you, to help you have a better week, a sharper mind, and maybe even a longer attention span.
And a special thanks to our sponsor, agentweekly.ai.
Until next time, stay curious.
Stay kind.
And keep compounding.